All right. So we just have the one little handout this morning. We've talked about bias several times and how bias, is written throughout history. If you read a history, it's so funny. I'm really interested in World War II history and things like that, and it's funny how you'll listen to a history program that the British have done, and the British are the heroes and the Americans didn't do much, and you listen to one made by the Americans, and the Americans were the heroes and the British didn't do much, and you could really see the bias play into those historical accounts. We talked about the story of Custer and how bias plays in. But bias is throughout our life. It's part of our worldview. We've talked about worldviews and how a worldview basically is the summation of our biases, or our biases, you would say. And so that has to do with the worldview. But we bring that same bias and that same worldview into how we interpret and how we read the Bible. And we don't think much about this, and most of the time. But every time we sit down and we open the Bible, we bring with it an interpretation, and we bring with it a bias. And this handout is a list of different things that we have, presuppositions that we sit down and we open the Bible up. And I have to admit, I was quite old before I began to think about, how a black person would read the Bible compared to us, or how an immigrant would read the Bible compared to us, how the difference between the way men and women read the Bible. And we bring all those different conceptions into how we interpret the Bible. And so it's important that we recognize that, and when we first open that book, we say, I need to take my bias out of this. You sit there, you say white, male, conservative, Church of Christ, on down the list. There's 18 different categories there. You could list all of those, and those all have an impact upon us. The way we read. The things about slavery is different than the way a black person would read about slavery. How we view the Ethiopian eunuch, how we view it is different. How we read about Ruth is different than the way women read about Ruth. Or the last book in Proverbs, the virtuous woman, we read that different than the way women do. But anyway, bias is ever present, and I thought that might be helpful. Next week we'll have a big handout again, but I thought that might be helpful for those of you who may have not thought about that in the past. And if you would think about that when you sit down with the Bible in the future, it may help you to open up your mind a little bit about how we read the Bible. One other announcement, as Biff mentioned, our schedule is a bit strange because we're doing first Sunday, and it's not the first Sunday, and the women usually don't sign cards on first Sunday, but since it's not anyway, the cards are over there for the ladies after class if you'd like to go sign them. If you'd do that, please. So a reminder there. One more reminder, and then we'll get started. We have all these lessons are recorded. At the end of the last lesson, we'll have another survey, and it looks a whole lot like the original surveys that you took. That the first two sections are exactly the same questions, and we'll answer those. And then there's just the third section is a little bit different because there's some comments, but it went away. But I want you to notice the question up there at the top that it's going to ask is, how many of the 13 lessons did you attend in person or through viewing the recordings? And I've said this before, but I want to mention it one more time. My minimum is 12. So out of 13, if you've not either seen the recordings or in person watched at least 12 of the 13 lessons, I'm not going to be able to use your data. And it's important that you do that. I'm begging, help me out. Watch the videos if you've missed, or trying to stay caught up with that, so that when we get to that final survey, the last class, which is about 3 weeks away, you'll be able to say, yes, I've viewed, or in person I've attended 12 or 13 of those classes. So I appreciate that so much. So at this point we've looked at three different theories of the resurrection. These are three different naturalistic theories, or theories that atheists have put forward to help explain the three bedrock facts of what happened to Jesus after He died. And we've gone through all those, and we've looked at three of them, and we've looked at how they're not very good theories. They don't have a lot of explanatory power or scope. They're not plausible. They have a lot of made-up stuff or ad hoc stuff, and we've looked at all of those. And so now we want to look at the Christian resurrection story or narrative, and then we're going to do some comparisons between, the Christian resurrection story and these other theories, and then we'll make a kind of a final historical determination. And I'll remind you again, we're still looking at this from a purely historical standpoint, and so we're not invoking the inspiration of the Holy Spirit at this point yet. Remember, we're leading Michael through all of these steps. Michael says, I don't believe in the Bible, don't talk to me about the Bible. And so we're getting him to a point to where we can change his mind about how he views the Bible, and we're still working that way, and we're not quite there yet. So this is a historical investigation, and how historians would look at this resurrection claim that the Christians claim. And so we'll begin to look at that. The first thing that we notice about the Christian resurrection narrative or the Christian story is that it's completely different from the other theories and the other stories that people try to tell to explain what happened to Jesus after He died. It's just completely different, and it doesn't take long before we realize that the Christian story requires a supernatural intervention. It requires a causal agent. That someone has to be, some supernatural cause has to be involved to raise Jesus from the dead. The others don't have this supernatural capacity. In fact, that's what they're trying to get away from. They're trying to present a theory that doesn't have anything to do with the supernatural. And so our theory, the Christian story, is a lot different in that regard. But we're still looking at this, as I said, from a historical standpoint. So as historians, since we're looking at this from a historical standpoint, as historians we can't say that there was a supernatural being that raised Jesus from the dead. And we've mentioned this before. That's outside the scope or outside the domain of a historical investigation. We can say that Jesus came back to life, that Jesus was raised from the dead, but a historian can't say that it was God or a supernatural agent that raised Him from the dead. Those are theological questions. That's within the theological domain or within the biblical domain to say that it was that it was God who raised Jesus from the dead. But a historian can't go that far. He's not a theologian, he's a historian. And so we keep that in mind. We're still looking at this as if we were historians. So the Christian story, the way we're going to approach this, since it's so different, is we're going to approach it from the standpoint of a defense or a counter-argument against all the critics that are out there. There's no need for me to stand up here and to say, this is what the Christians believe about the resurrection. We all know that. And so I'm not going to waste our time with that. So we'll turn it around and we'll look at not all, but we'll look at some of the major criticisms that are put out there by non-believers. And we'll look at those and we'll evaluate through that. So what we're doing is actually a counter-argument or polemics. How many have heard the word polemics before? This is an argument in defense of, this is arguing against other people's view, and that's what polemics is. And so we are going to form a polemical argument against the doubters or the unbelievers. So the way to do that is to take these categories that the critics argue against. And we'll take those categories and then we'll start to look at them from a feasibility standpoint. But most of these arguments that they come up with fall into three general categories. And the first category is they say that it's legend. The Christian resurrection narrative, the Christian story, it's full of legend. That the early Christians started this story right after the resurrection, and they've kept adding to it, and it's grown, and over time it ended up being this great big legend that's not hardly believable. And so it grew into legend. Critics say that it violates Occam's razor, and we'll define that a little bit more in a minute, but it's basically another version of ad hoc or made up stuff. They say it's full of made up stuff. And we'll look at Occam's razor here in a moment. And then the big one is they say that our sources are deficient. Thank you. You hear me back there now? All right, good. They say that our sources are deficient, and this is a big category. We hear about and read about this all the time, that the sources that we use are not any good. Basically, the Gospels and the different things that we rely upon to present evidence for the Christian resurrection, they're just not good sources. And so we begin with the first one. They say that. Come on now. Let it catch up maybe. The first one is legend. And we want to look at that in more detail about their claim that the Christian resurrection. Well, I'm froze up. Christian resurrection narrative is all legend. And so, there's some elements of that are true. I don't know if I would say that it's actually legend, but we do know that there's some things that are, in our Bible that may or may not have been there in the original autographs and the original readings. We know, like Ephesians 1:1, there's the argument over whether in Ephesus was added or not. That wording in Ephesus. The argument is that wasn't there. It was a circular letter and it was later added. And so, is that legend or something that's added in? There's the argument about what they call pseudo-mark. We've talked about that. Mark 16:9 through 20, whether that was added on later or not. And you could say that perhaps that's legend. But the Gospels are theological biographies. That's the genre that they're in. And theological biographies in the first century were histories, basically, but they were written different than histories are written today. They gave the authors some liberty to make a point, to add their own particular bias to it. And so we see that play out in history even in our own day. We look at the assassination of President Kennedy and we look at all the bias and all that's grown into legend now. I mean, you could watch something, perhaps happened, but we don't know. But some of the stories have grown into this big legend, a big conspiracy. Maybe true, maybe not, but it could fall under the category of legend. But one thing about those legends or conspiracy theories about President Kennedy is that the main thrust of that story is true, right? Kennedy's dead. Somebody shot Kennedy. And so the peripheral details, may not line up exactly. And so if we look at the Gospels in that way, that then possibly, and here again, we're looking as historians, not as an inerrant, as we look at the Bible, we're not calling upon inerrancy. But legend is different. The Gospels are not legend. How many of you have heard of the Gospel of Peter? So the Gospel of Peter is a Gnostic writing. It's the spiritual writing. All that problem that Paul was having in the churches, during the first century, were these Gnostic interpretations, and that was infiltrating some of the churches. That's a big problem that they're having at Corinth in his first letter to the Corinthians. But there were several of these Gnostic writings in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century that claimed to be written by an apostle. That's the best way to get credibility for your writing, is to use somebody else's name. If I wrote something and said somebody else popular wrote it, that would give my writing a lot more popularity. And so the Gospel of Peter was written by somebody that used Peter's name to gain credibility. But I want you to listen to what the Gospel of Peter says about the resurrection, and this is legend. This is what legend sounds like. So this is what whoever the writer wrote. But in the night in which the Lord's day dawned, when the soldiers were safeguarding it 2 by 2 in every watch, there was a loud voice in heaven. And they saw that the heavens were opened, and that 2 males who had much radiance had come down from there and came near the sepulchre. But that stone which had been thrust against the door, having rolled by itself, went a distance off the side, and the sepulchre opened, and both the young men entered. And so those soldiers, having seen, awakened the centurion and the elders, for they too were there present, safeguarding. And while they were relating what they had seen, again they see 3 males who have come out from the sepulchre, with the 2 supporting the other one, and a cross following them. And the heads of the 2 are reaching up to the heavens, and the head of the third is going beyond the heavens. And they're hearing a voice from the heavens saying, "Have you made proclamation of the fallen asleep?" And an obeisance was heard from the cross saying, "Yes." That's legend. Soldiers, guards, Jewish elders, they're all hanging out at the tomb. 2 huge angels that are so tall their heads go up into the heaven, they come down, they take Jesus out, and Jesus is so huge that his head goes all the way up into heaven. And then there's a cross that's moving by itself behind them, and the cross is talking. That's legend. That's not the Gospels. Now compare that to the resurrection story that you read in Mark. It's straightforward, it's to the point, it's plain, it's not full of legend. Mark is unpretentious. Legend is full of bias. Now we see why the Gospel of Peter wasn't canonized. But that's what legend looks like. To argue that the Christian resurrection is legend is invalid. It's not a valid point. The second argument is that it violates Occam's razor. And Occam's razor is a logical principle that they use in logic to help with reasoning. And they use this in all sorts of aspects of life. And basically it says that a story or a theory that has more components to it, that the more complex it is, the less believable it is. You know, it's like the little kid, you know, he comes in with muddy shoes on. "What happened to your shoes?" "Well, I was walking and then this monster came out and the monster was chased by the police, and then I jumped in the puddle and fought the bad guy, and the policeman put me," you know, and you go, no. It's too complex. "What happened?" "Well, I saw a mud puddle and I jumped in it." That's more logical, right? But it's a true thing. And this was developed by a Franciscan friar named William of Occam. And it's been used for over 1,000 years. We use it in our own lives all the time. We don't realize it. But Occam's razor is closely related to ad hoc. And we've talked about that. So the more stuff you make up to fill in the gaps of a story, the more complex it becomes. The more complex it becomes, the more it violates Occam's razor. So simpler is better, and simpler is usually truer. If the story is more simple, if there's 2 stories about what happened, the one that's really complex is probably not true. And they're saying that the Christian resurrection story is too complex. There's too much to it. It can't be true because it violates that. We've talked about the golden ratio, that ratio of things we see in nature that cause our eyes to say that's beautiful. That's part of Occam's razor as well. It's the beauty of simplicity, right? We don't hear about the beauty of complexity. You often hear about the beauty of simplicity. And that beauty of simplicity, you know, falls in line with Occam's razor. But that beauty of simplicity is also used in architecture. You know, the plain and the simple. That's what's so attractive about Amish furniture. If any of you see Amish furniture, it's because it's simple. It's not complex. The Restoration Movement leaders, the leaders that the Church of Christ eventually came from, often talked about the Bible and that our focus on that was plain and simple. We don't have a complex religion. We don't have all these different traditions. We don't have all the candle lighting and the Hail Marys and all this stuff that goes along with some of the other traditions. Ours is plain and simple. It's not complex. And so that runs along as well. But I want you to think back about these natural theories that we've looked at. How complex are they? I mean, they're talking about hallucinations. And how, the hallucination of the person, okay, maybe, but hallucinations in groups, how does that come about? Or any of these altered states of consciousness, those are very complex explanations for what happened to Jesus after he was crucified. Those become, in and of themselves, they violate Occam's razor. And so their argument against the Christians' viewpoint that the resurrection story violates Occam's razor is invalid as well. But the big one is deficient sources, and we'll spend a good bit of time on this. By the way, this session is going to roll over into next week as well, so we'll get as far as we can get. But deficient sources seems to be where a lot of time is invested by the unbelievers. And so this is where we'll spend a good bit of time. The criticism of the sources that Christians use to use as evidence to explain their story really takes two categories. It falls into two categories. So the deficient sources, they say there's either not enough evidence, or they say that there's not enough evidence, and that evidence that is available is unreliable, that the sources are unreliable. So that's the two things that are wrong with our evidence, so to speak. Not enough evidence and unreliable sources. And this is a long-running argument about the authenticity of the Gospels. That's where this comes from. And we've talked about Bart Ehrman, the popular atheistic, the popular critic, the Bible scholar that's now a critic of Christianity. One of the things he really attacks is the authenticity of the Gospels. And so we'll talk about this to some extent here. And then if you think I've missed something and left something out, we're going to pick it up again in 2 or 3 weeks. And we'll look at the Gospels and Scripture in a deeper sense there. So if you think I've missed something, just hold on. And again, I'll remind you, we're still just scratching the surface of all of this stuff as we go through. But what they say about the Gospels in particular, under the deficient sources, is they say the Gospels are not written by eyewitnesses. They say they're just written by somebody, kind of like the Gnostic writings, that they're not really written by eyewitnesses. We'll look at here in a minute that one of the big arguments is that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the names we put on those Gospels, that's not the people who wrote them. They're making the same claim that's made of the Gnostic writings. Somebody else wrote those, that it wasn't the eyewitness that wrote those. So that's what they say. The Gospels are not written by eyewitnesses. They say that they were written late. And they consider late to be 35 to 65 years after Jesus' death. So you remember we said the closer to the event that a history is written, the more likely it is that it's truthful and accurate. And they're saying now there's this gap here. There's this time span of 35 to 65 years. And so it becomes full of legend. And so it's not trustworthy anymore. They say that it contains propaganda. And that it was altered. And there's verification of this because there's discrepancies that we see. They say that there's no extra biblical sources that mention Jesus. That's sources outside of the Bible. There's no sources anywhere that mention Jesus until 80 years after his death. And so that's the basis of their argument. There's other ones scattered around, but these are the major arguments that critics make of the Gospels. And so we need to dig deeper into these. Remember, this is a polemic. So we're arguing against these points. We're arguing against Michael. These are things possibly that Michael will say. Michael heard these. You know, he heard it on the news, or he hears it on Snapchat or whatever the kids do these days. He's heard these little sound bites, you know, these little 30-second clips, and now he throws that out there and that out there. This is what Michael will say. He said, well, the Gospels aren't written by eyewitnesses. And so we have to develop a polemic against that. And we say, well, okay, so they're not written by eyewitnesses. That's the position that they take. You know, the Gospels were canonized under the knowledge that they were written by the eyewitnesses or close associates of the eyewitnesses. So it's not direct eyewitness testimony, but it's associates of the eyewitnesses as well. But it's not uncommon that histories are written, you know, by non-eyewitnesses. Even if this were the case, they're making a big deal about, you know, the Gospels are not written by eyewitnesses. Even if we grant that, which we won't, but even if we said that, in the real world, there's no histories of Alexander the Great that are written by eyewitnesses. You know, the people that wrote about him, we talked about Suetonius and Tacitus. You know, the historians, Roman historians, they were not eyewitnesses to the events of Alexander the Great. They wrote histories about it. Most of the Civil War histories are not written by eyewitnesses. There's no living memory of Abraham Lincoln or Robert E. Lee. There's no living memory of those people. And yet they're still turning out very, very good historical accounts of what happened during the Civil War. And they're not written by eyewitnesses, but they're very, very good and very strong accounts. Even so, virtually all of the biblical scholars hold that Mark and Luke contain eyewitness testimonies. Matthew provides his own testimony. Mark provides the testimony of Peter. Luke provides the testimony of Paul. And John provides the testimony of his own eyewitness. And this is supported by the early 2nd century church leader named Papias. Papias lived and his life overlapped with the apostles. He knew John, and he ran around with Philip's 2 daughters. And so he knew the apostles, and his life overlapped with them. And Papias said, he verifies that Mark wrote Peter's account and that Luke wrote Paul's account. And so we have a testimony that says that those are eyewitness accounts. Every gospel fragment that we have that has the cover sheet on it has Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John written on the cover. Every single copy that we have. There's no copies in existence that have the cover page that don't have the name of the author on it. And there's no other names other than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we have fragments that are just, you know, sheets of the documents of the Gospels that don't have the cover sheet, but every single one of them attributes. There's not any evidence that the Gospels were written by anyone other than the eyewitnesses or the close associates. So the Gospels, they say that, are not eyewitness accounts, is invalid. And I wrote about this, and I thought the irony of this, how funny. So Papias lives right in the area with the apostles. He lives in Jerusalem. His life overlaps with the apostles. He knows John, and he hangs out with Philip's 2 daughters. And he says this is who authored the Gospels. And then we have Bart Ehrman from Lawrence, Kansas. 2,000 years later, that says, no, I don't think that's true. I just think that, you know, the audacity of that, or the how do you sell that? But he is. He's selling that to people. It's just interesting, though. Closer to the event is always more accurate. And so the claim that the Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses invalid, and there's a stack of books on this. So, like I said, we've just scratched the surface. I'd invite you to investigate that on your own. The second complaint is that the accounts were written late. Well, what is late? You know, somebody today is writing something about the Civil War. That's late. It's certainly later than 35 to 65 years after the event. And so, it's not that uncommon for something to be written that late, to be written later after the fact. Augustus was considered one of Rome's greatest emperors. And the closest history that's written about him is 50 plus years later. You know, by comparison, we've got 4 biographies of Jesus that are written within 60 years of his life. And that doesn't count the oral tradition. Remember, we talked about the kerygma, these oral creeds that are embedded into Scripture. We talked about 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7, 3 through 5. That was an oral creed that goes all the way back to Jerusalem, goes right back to the apostles, the eyewitnesses that started up perhaps just months after the resurrection. The apostles are in Jerusalem and they say, all right, so what are we going to preach? And they say, we're going to preach that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried and that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures. That's what we're going to say. Even the hardcore atheists say, yeah, that's an oral tradition, and it goes all the way back to the Jerusalem apostles. So there's some authenticity in that. That makes it early, not late. You know, the written Gospels are writings about the oral tradition. So the information that they're writing is early, it's not late. Just because it was put on paper doesn't mean that it's late. The accounts that were written late is an invalid argument as well. But if we move on to we still work on this. So here's an interesting thing. This is Tiberius Caesar and of course Jesus. And so we look at the number of writings about these two. About how, these we're talking about sources again. And if we look at these, there's 9 sources, non-Christian sources, that talk about Tiberius Caesar within 150 years of the event. And there's 9 sources that talk about Jesus, non-canonical sources that talk about Jesus in the first 150 years after the event. So that is a 9-to-9 ratio. But if we add in the Christian sources, Tiberius Caesar gets one more evidence, one more source, and Jesus, the Christian story, gets 33 more sources. That's a ratio of 10 to 42. There's 4 times as many sources that speak about Jesus as there are about Tiberius Caesar, and no one questions the historicity of Tiberius' reign. They count on those sources and they don't question that. But this brings up another point, though. And we say that the New Testament is written right in that period, the first writings. And we say that Galatians is most likely the first document, the first writing, Paul's writing to the Galatians, dated at about 48 to 50 AD. And so we're talking about this red period in here. And you can see the cross at 33, and there's this gap, this from 33 to 45. How do you explain that gap? And this is something that the critics look at and they go, how come there's this gap in there? If there's something like the resurrection really happened, wouldn't the early Christians be just frantically writing all that happened, and they were of a writing tradition. All the Old Testament is written. They'd guarded all those books. They had all the intertestamental writings. They had some apocrypha writings the Old Testament apocrypha that they kept and they cherished, and all of that. And a lot of these were Jews. Why weren't they writing all this stuff down immediately? And so there's a gap in there. There's this post-resurrection gap that's right there. There's nothing written there. How do we answer that? That's the critics come after that. How come there's nothing there? It makes it difficult to believe.
We don't necessarily know that.
Hold on. The first reason that the gap exists, and this is where you're headed, is that they were anticipating Jesus' return. There's even biblical evidence that says that Jesus says, "You'll not finish going through the towns of Israel before the Son of Man returns." He says that in Matthew 10. So he said, wow, well, if he's coming back that quick, there's no need to write anything down. I'm not going to waste my time writing if he's coming back that quick. Again, he says in Matthew 23:34, he says, "Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away." And if you'll turn to page 43 in your notes, there's a misquote I have in Matthew 23:24, and I think it's on the slide too. It should be 24:34. So if you want to change that. I'm my own editor, so so I think it looks good, and I missed it. So anyway, so there's a couple of things that Jesus said, I'm coming back soon. So, let's don't write anything down if he's coming back that quick. If we read in 1 Thessalonians, Paul is admonishing those people for their idleness. They're saying, why work? Jesus is coming back pretty quick. I'm not going to kill myself. I'm just going to hang out and do nothing and wait on Jesus to come back. And Paul admonishes them against that. So there was this mindset that Jesus is coming back. There's no need to write anything down. The Diocletian destruction, and this is probably where Sonny's mind was going. In February of 303, Diocletian, the Caesar of Rome, ordered that Christians be persecuted, that they be killed, that they be imprisoned, and that all their documents be destroyed. Tear up their churches, burn their documents, get rid of everything that they have. And so over the next 8 years, there was 8 years of this before Constantine came in. Over those 8 years, scores and scores and scores of documents, Christian documents, were burned and destroyed. We don't have any idea what was in that. There could have very well have been some written documents in that. We talked about Q. I don't know if I talked about the hypothetical. Scholars think there was a hypothetical document that they refer to as Q, which were quotations of Jesus, and that Matthew and Luke used Q as a source for part of their writing, and it's a theory. But a document like Q could have existed. It could have been burned during that period. You remember, this is right after the resurrection, so these documents, there's not hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of copies. There's just a few copies. You get those few copies and you burn them, and that's the end of it. And so we don't know what was burned in there. As Christians, we say, and we'll get to that, the Bible's sufficient. Everything we've got, this is all we need. So we don't need those documents anyway. But from a historical perspective, and looking at this from a historical standpoint and a polemic against the Michaels of the world, we have to answer that. And the answer is we don't know what was burned. And it's not an argument from silence either, because they did burn documents. We just don't know what documents or what they entailed. And so the next one is the Gospels as propaganda. They say that the Gospels were just created to help the church grow. They had to come up with a neat story like the resurrection, and oh yeah, and the resurrection means that you'll live forever. If you follow our group, if you come along with the way, you'll live forever. And this is all, we made this up. The accusation Christians made this up as propaganda to help their movement grow. And we could say, from a historical standpoint, there is some bias in there. There is some things in it, in the Bible that are promoting. But what is not promoting? Any history that's written promotes one view or another. Everything promotes some particular view. There's nothing that's neutral. Anything you write has some type of intent behind it. You don't write for nothing. Nothing is written in a neutral sense. So there's certainly some truth in that. They call it propaganda, and we would call it the joy of the gospel. But these discrepancies we'll pick up there. Don't forget to sign cards. We'll pick up there with the account discrepancies next time. Thank you.